In the mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every rocky crevice and survival depends on split-second decisions, 22-year-old Sarah Martinez learned that sometimes the greatest enemy isn't the one shooting at you. It's the one standing right beside you. What started as her first deployment as a combat medic quickly became a nightmare that would test not just her medical skills, but her will to survive when her own squad turned against her. This is the story of how a rookie medic, abandoned and betrayed in hostile territory, used nothing but her training, her courage, and the very landscape that trapped her to turn the hunters into the hunted. The helicopter's rotors cut through the thin mountain air as Sarah Martinez gripped her medical bag tighter, watching the rugged Afghan landscape rush beneath them. At 22, she was the youngest member of Alpha Squad, fresh out of combat medic training with barely 6 months of real-world experience under her belt. The other soldiers called her Doc, with a mix of respect and skepticism that she'd grown accustomed to during her brief time in the service. Sergeant Collins, a grizzled veteran with 15 years of combat experience, glanced at her from across the helicopter's cramped interior. His weathered face showed no emotion as he spoke into his headset, coordinating their mission parameters with command. Sarah had noticed something different about Collins lately, a coldness in his interactions with her that went beyond typical military professionalism. She tried to dismiss it as the stress of deployment, but the feeling gnawed at her. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Establish a forward medical post in a remote village where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were hiding weapons and using civilians as human shields. Sarah's job was to provide medical support for both the squad and any civilians they encountered. It was exactly the kind of mission she'd trained for, combining her medical expertise with the tactical awareness needed to operate in a combat zone. As the helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone, Sarah ran through her mental checklist one final time. Her medical bag contained everything from basic first aid supplies to advanced trauma equipment. She'd memorized the layout of the village from satellite photos and knew the locations of potential evacuation points. What she didn't know was that some of her squad mates had already decided she wouldn't be leaving the mountain alive. The landing was rough, kicking up clouds of dust that stung Sarah's eyes and filled her nose with the acrid smell of diesel fuel and desert earth. Alpha Squad moved quickly away from the helicopter, establishing a defensive perimeter as the aircraft lifted off and disappeared into the cloudless sky. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through rocky outcroppings and the occasional bleat of a goat somewhere in the valley below. Collins raised his hand, signaling for the squad to move out. They advanced in formation through terrain that seemed designed to kill unwary soldiers. Loose rocks threatened to send them tumbling down steep slopes, while narrow paths offered perfect ambush points for anyone familiar with the area. Sarah found herself struggling to keep up with the pace, her medical bag weighing her down more than she'd anticipated in the thin mountain air. Private Jackson, a wiry soldier from Texas with a reputation for cruel humor, kept glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Earlier that morning, she'd overheard him talking with Collins and Corporal Williams about something they called the problem, but when they noticed her listening, the conversation had stopped abruptly. Now, as they navigated the treacherous mountain path, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was the problem they'd been discussing. The village appeared suddenly, as they crested a ridge, spread out below them like a collection of mud brick houses scattered across the valley floor. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Sarah could see people moving between the buildings, mostly women and children, with a few elderly men tending to livestock. It looked peaceful enough, but Sarah's training had taught her that appearances could be deadly in this part of the world. Collins called for a halt and gathered the squad around him. His voice was low and steady as he outlined their approach, but Sarah noticed that he avoided making eye contact with her. The plan was simple. They would establish their forward post in an abandoned building on the village's outskirts, then conduct a systematic search for weapons and insurgent activity. Sarah's role was to set up a basic medical station and be ready to treat casualties from either side. As they prepared to move into the village, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. Corporal Williams, a stocky soldier from Ohio who'd always seemed friendly enough, leaned close to her ear. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words chilled her blood. "Doc, you might want to stay extra alert today. Sometimes the biggest threats come from unexpected places." Before she could ask what he meant, Williams had already moved away, leaving Sarah to wonder whether his warning was genuine concern or something more sinister. The abandoned building Collins had chosen for their forward post sat at the edge of the village, its mud brick walls scarred by bullet holes from some long-ago firefight. Sarah quickly set up her medical station in what had once been the building's main room, arranging her supplies and equipment with practiced efficiency. The space was cramped and dirty, but it would serve their purposes for the few hours they planned to be in the area. While Sarah worked, the rest of the squad began their search of the village. She could hear them moving from house to house, their voices growing fainter as they worked their way deeper into the settlement. The villagers seemed cooperative enough, but Sarah knew that meant little in a place where cooperation with coalition forces could mean death at the hands of Taliban fighters after the soldiers left. Hours passed without incident. Sarah treated a few minor injuries: a child with an infected cut on his leg, an elderly woman with chronic pain in her joints, a teenage boy who'd burned his hand while working near a cooking fire. The work was routine, but satisfying, reminding her why she'd chosen to become a combat medic in the first place. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that this might actually be one of those rare missions where everything went according to plan. That illusion shattered when Collins returned to the forward post with a grim expression on his face. He waited until the other squad members had gathered before speaking, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. "We've got a problem, Doc," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Command just radioed with some disturbing intelligence. Seems there's been a security leak back at base. Someone's been passing information to Taliban fighters about our patrol routes and mission objectives." Sarah felt her stomach drop as Collins continued talking. According to him, the leak had been traced to someone with access to medical records and casualty reports, someone who could use that information to help insurgents plan attacks on coalition forces. The implication was clear, even though Collins never said it directly. Sarah was being accused of treason, of betraying the very soldiers she'd sworn to protect and serve. The accusation was absurd, and Sarah said so in no uncertain terms. She'd never had contact with anyone outside the chain of command, never shared classified information with unauthorized personnel, never done anything that could remotely be construed as aiding the enemy. But as she looked around at the faces of her squad mates, she realized that her protestations of innocence were falling on deaf ears. These men had already made up their minds about her guilt. Jackson stepped forward with cable ties in his hands, his face twisted into an ugly smile. "Sorry, Doc," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Orders are orders. We're supposed to secure you until extraction." The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting, but Sarah realized that the truth didn't matter anymore. Whatever was happening here had been planned long before they'd ever left base that morning. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what was really going on. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The strange conversations she'd overheard, the cold treatment from Collins, the warning from Williams that she'd initially interpreted as concern for her safety. Her squad mates hadn't brought her to this remote mountain village to serve as their medic. They brought her here to kill her. As Jackson moved closer with the cable ties, Sarah made a decision that would save her life. Instead of submitting to restraint like a compliant prisoner, she grabbed a smoke grenade from her belt and pulled the pin. Dense white smoke immediately began billowing from the device, filling the small room and reducing visibility to almost zero. In the confusion that followed, Sarah dove through the building's back window, landing hard on the rocky ground outside. She could hear shouting behind her as Collins and the others tried to organize pursuit through the smoke-filled building. But Sarah was already moving, Her medical bag clutched to her chest as she sprinted toward the rocky outcroppings that surrounded the village. She'd studied the terrain during their approach, and now that knowledge might be the only thing standing between her and a bullet in the back. The first shots rang out as Sarah reached the relative safety of the rocks, the crack of rifle fire echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. She could hear Collins shouting orders to his men, coordinating their search as they spread out to hunt her down. But Sarah had advantages her would-be killers didn't fully appreciate. As a combat medic, she'd been trained not just to treat wounds, but to survive in hostile environments where medical personnel were often targeted by enemy forces. Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone of a boulder, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard across the entire valley. The rifle shots had stopped, but she could hear boots crunching on gravel as Collins and his men spread out to search for her. Their voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, and what she heard made her blood run cold. She can't have gone far. Jackson's voice drifted up from somewhere below her position. Little bitch is probably hiding behind the first rock she could find. His casual cruelty confirmed what Sarah had already begun to suspect. This wasn't about some fabricated intelligence leak. This was personal, and it had been planned from the beginning. Collins's response was more measured, but no less chilling. Fan out and check every hiding spot. She's got maybe an hour's head start, but there's nowhere to run up here. We finish this now, and we tell command she was killed in action during a Taliban ambush. Clean and simple. The cold professionalism in his voice was somehow worse than Jackson's obvious hatred. To Collins, her murder was just another tactical problem to be solved efficiently. Sarah forced herself to think logically despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her rational mind. She was outnumbered 4-1 by heavily armed soldiers who knew these mountains almost as well as she did. They had radios, night vision equipment, and enough ammunition to wage a small war. She had a medical bag, basic survival gear, and the knowledge that staying put meant certain death. But Sarah also had something her hunters might not have fully considered: specialized training in battlefield medicine that included extensive instruction in surviving behind enemy lines. Combat medics were taught to operate independently when necessary, to find water and shelter, to evade capture, and to use whatever resources were available to stay alive until rescue arrived. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very skills intended to help her save other soldiers' lives might now be the only things keeping her own heart beating. Moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose stones, Sarah began working her way higher up the mountainside. The terrain was treacherous, with loose scree that could send rocks tumbling down to reveal her position, but it also offered countless hiding places among the jumbled boulders and narrow crevices. More importantly, gaining elevation would give her a tactical advantage, allowing her to see her pursuers while remaining hidden herself. As she climbed, Sarah's mind cataloged everything in her medical bag that might serve a dual purpose. Morphine syringes could be used as weapons if she could get close enough to inject an attacker. Surgical tubing might work as improvised restraints or even a garrote. Antiseptic solutions were flammable and could be used to create diversions or makeshift incendiary devices. Her medical training had taught her to see these supplies as tools for healing, but desperation was teaching her to see them as weapons of survival. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Sarah finally found what she was looking for: a narrow cave formed by two massive boulders that had fallen against each other centuries ago. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it was hidden from below by an overhang of rock. Better yet, the cave extended back into the mountainside far enough to provide concealment, while still allowing her to monitor the approaches. Sarah carefully arranged her position inside the cave, using rocks to create firing positions that would allow her to defend the narrow entrance if necessary. She had one service pistol with 3 full magazines. Not much firepower against 4 assault rifles, but enough to make any direct assault costly for her attackers. More importantly, the confined space of the cave entrance would negate their numerical advantage, forcing them to come at her one at a time if they found her hiding place. While she worked, Sarah could hear her former squad mates calling to each other as they searched the rocks below. Their voices revealed growing frustration as the afternoon wore on without any sign of their quarry. Jackson's curses grew more creative and vicious with each passing hour, while Collins maintained his cold professionalism, but with an edge of urgency that suggested he was beginning to worry about their timeline. "We need to wrap this up," Sarah heard Williams say during a lull in the search. His voice sounded closer than the others, and she pressed herself deeper into the shadows of her cave. "Command's going to expect a status report soon, and we can't afford to have this drag on too long." There was something different about Williams's tone, less confident than Collins, less cruel than Jackson. Sarah filed that observation away as potentially useful information. As darkness began to fall across the mountain, Sarah faced a crucial decision. She could remain hidden and hope her pursuers would eventually give up the search, but that seemed unlikely given what she'd overheard about their plans to report her death. Alternatively, she could try to escape under cover of darkness, but the treacherous terrain would be even more dangerous in the dark, and her hunters had night vision equipment that would give them a significant advantage. The third option was the most dangerous, but potentially the most effective. She could go on the offensive. Sarah's medical training included extensive instruction in human anatomy, giving her detailed knowledge of exactly where and how to inflict maximum damage with minimum effort. Combined with the element of surprise and her intimate knowledge of the terrain, she might be able to turn the tables on at least some of her attackers. Sarah's opportunity came sooner than expected. Private Jackson, apparently frustrated by hours of fruitless searching, began climbing toward her general area with less caution than military doctrine would recommend. His rifle was slung across his back, and he was using both hands to navigate the steep, rocky slope. Most critically, he was alone, separated from the others by several hundred yards of broken terrain. Moving with the careful precision her medical training had drilled into her, Sarah extracted a morphine syringe from her bag and removed the safety cap. The needle was long enough to penetrate clothing and deliver its contents directly into muscle tissue. A full dose of morphine wouldn't kill a healthy adult, but it would render them unconscious within minutes and helpless for hours. More importantly, it would be almost impossible to detect without sophisticated medical testing. Sarah waited until Jackson was directly below her position before making her move. She dropped silently from her hiding spot onto the rocks behind him, moving with the fluid grace of someone whose life depended on making no sound. Jackson had no warning before she grabbed him from behind, clamping one hand over his mouth while driving the morphine-filled syringe into his neck with the other. Jackson thrashed violently for several seconds, his muffled shouts absorbed by Sarah's palm pressed against his lips. But the morphine worked quickly, and within moments his struggles grew weaker and more uncoordinated. Sarah held him until his body went completely limp, then carefully lowered him to the ground behind a cluster of boulders where he wouldn't be easily visible from below. Working quickly, Sarah stripped Jackson of his rifle, ammunition, radio, and night vision goggles. She also took his knife, his sidearm, and the contents of his pockets, including a photograph that made her stomach turn. The picture showed Jackson and several other soldiers at what appeared to be a celebration dinner. Collins was there, along with Williams and two other men Sarah didn't recognize. They were all raising their glasses in a toast, and someone had written "Mission Accomplished" across the bottom in black ink. The photograph confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. Her planned murder wasn't the result of some spontaneous decision or even a specific grievance against her personally. This was part of something larger, more organized, and potentially involving people beyond the members of Alpha Squad. The celebration dinner had clearly taken place before their deployment, suggesting that her death had been planned for weeks or even months. Sarah secured Jackson's unconscious form with his own restraints, ensuring he wouldn't be able to sound an alarm if he regained consciousness before the morphine wore off. She also disabled his radio and removed the batteries from his night vision equipment. If he did wake up, he would be blind, deaf, and unable to communicate with the others until someone found him. With Jackson neutralized and his equipment in her possession, Sarah's tactical situation had improved dramatically. She now had a proper assault rifle with plenty of ammunition, night vision capability, and a radio that would allow her to monitor Collins's communications with the remaining members of the search party. Most importantly, she had evened the odds by reducing her hunters from 4 to 3. But Sarah knew that taking Jackson out of the fight was only the beginning. Collins and the others would eventually notice his absence and begin searching for him. When they found him, or failed to find him, they would realize that their prey had become a predator. The hunt would continue, but now Sarah would be doing some of the hunting herself. The crackling voice of Sergeant Collins cut through the static of Jackson's radio as Sarah monitored their communications from her rocky perch. "Jackson, report your position. We're regrouping at the North Ridge." The calm professionalism in his voice hadn't changed, but Sarah could detect an underlying tension. They'd been searching for hours without success, and the approaching darkness was making their job infinitely more difficult. Sarah waited several minutes before Collins tried again. "Jackson, respond immediately." "That's an order." This time, there was no mistaking the edge of concern in the sergeant's voice. When Jackson failed to answer a third transmission, Sarah heard Collins curse quietly before switching to a different channel to contact Williams and the fourth squad member, Corporal Martinez. "We've got a problem." Collins's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Jackson's not responding to radio calls. Either his equipment failed, or our little medic is more dangerous than we thought." The admission that she might pose a real threat would have been satisfying under different circumstances. Right now, Sarah was focused on the tactical implications of Collins's growing awareness that the hunt wasn't going according to plan. Sarah adjusted Jackson's night vision goggles and scanned the terrain below her position. The green-tinted view revealed Collins and Williams moving carefully through the rocks about 400 yards to the northwest. The third man, Martinez, was approaching from the south along a ridge that would bring him within 50 yards of Jackson's unconscious form. If Martinez discovered his teammate's fate, Sarah's advantage of surprise would disappear. Making a quick decision, Sarah began moving through the rocks toward Martinez's position. She left Jackson's rifle behind, relying instead on her medical bag and the element of surprise. The terrain worked in her favor, providing concealment while she maneuvered into position. Martinez was focused on searching for signs of her passage and didn't notice the predator stalking him from above. Sarah waited until Martinez paused to examine something that had caught his attention, probably tracks she'd deliberately left to lure him into position. Moving with the silent precision her survival training had taught her, she descended from her elevated hiding spot and approached from his blind side. This time, she didn't bother with morphine. A sleeper hold applied correctly would render him unconscious without the risk of chemical complications. Martinez never knew what hit him. Sarah's arm snaked around his throat from behind, applying pressure to the carotid arteries while avoiding the windpipe to prevent permanent damage. Despite her medical oath to do no harm, Sarah had long since accepted that her survival might require temporarily harming others. Martinez struggled briefly before going limp in her arms, his body weight a dead weight that she lowered carefully to the ground. Working with the efficiency of someone whose life depended on speed, Sarah secured Martinez with his own equipment and stripped him of anything useful. His radio revealed that Collins was growing increasingly agitated about the lack of communication from his men. Williams seemed nervous, asking repeatedly about extraction plans and whether they should abort the mission. Collins's responses were sharp and decisive. They would complete their objective regardless of complications. Sarah was adjusting Martinez's night vision equipment when she heard footsteps approaching through the rocks. Williams appeared around a boulder cluster, his rifle ready, and his head turning constantly as he searched for threats. He spotted Martinez's motionless form immediately and raised his weapon, scanning the surrounding terrain for any sign of an ambush. "Collins, I found Martinez." Williams spoke quietly into his radio. "He's unconscious but breathing. No visible wounds, but he's secured with his own restraints. Jackson's nowhere in sight." The fear in his voice was unmistakable now. Williams was beginning to understand that they were no longer hunting a frightened medic. They were being systematically taken apart by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Collins's response crackled through the radio with cold fury. "Fall back to the rally point. We regroup and finish this properly. She's just one person, and she can't have taken them both without getting lucky. We end this now, or we don't go home at all." The threat in those last words was clear. Collins had passed the point of no return and would kill anyone who stood between him and his objective. Sarah watched through her night vision as Williams backed away from Martinez's position, his movements careful, but increasingly frantic. She could have taken him then, adding another unconscious soldier to her growing collection, but something stopped her. Williams had been the one to warn her earlier, and his nervousness suggested he might not be as committed to her murder as the others. Perhaps there was another way to handle the situation. Moving carefully to stay hidden, Sarah followed Williams as he made his way toward the rally point where Collins waited. Her plan was forming as she moved, built around the growing cracks she'd observed in the group's solidarity. Williams was scared and questioning their mission. Martinez had seemed reluctant earlier when Collins first laid out the fabricated charges against her. Only Collins and Jackson appeared fully committed to seeing her dead, and Jackson was currently enjoying an involuntary nap behind a boulder. The rally point was a flat area between two large rock formations that offered good visibility in all directions. Collins had chosen well. It would be difficult to approach without being seen, and the open space prevented anyone from getting close enough for hand-to-hand combat. But Sarah's medical training had taught her to think creatively about problems, and she'd been studying this terrain for hours while her hunters searched for her. Sarah positioned herself on the ridge above the rally point and keyed Jackson's radio to Collins's frequency. When she spoke, her voice was calm and professional, betraying none of the fear and rage burning in her chest. "Sergeant Collins, this is Document. I think it's time we had a conversation about what's really happening here." The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Collins recovered quickly, his voice carrying across the radio waves with its familiar authority. "Martinez, you're alive. Good. Report to the rally point immediately, and we'll get you evacuated for medical treatment." The lie was smooth and practiced, designed to draw her into the open where his rifle could finish what he'd started. "Nice try, Sergeant, but I've already had my medical evaluation today. Diagnosis: acute case of betrayal by people I trusted with my life." Sarah kept her voice level despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her self-control. "I know about the photograph, Collins. The celebration dinner before deployment. This isn't about intelligence leaks or battlefield mistakes. This is about something else entirely, and I want to know what it is." The radio silence stretched for nearly a minute before Collins responded. When he did, his voice had lost its professional facade and revealed something much colder underneath. "You always were too smart for your own good, Document. Should have minded your own business instead of asking questions about things that didn't concern you." The admission was as close to a confession as Sarah was likely to get. Williams's voice cut through the tension, shaky and uncertain. "Sarge, maybe we should reconsider this. Martinez and Jackson are down, and she's proven she can handle herself. Maybe we can work something out that doesn't involve anyone else getting hurt." The plea in his voice suggested he was looking for any excuse to abandon the mission. Collins's response was immediate and brutal. "Williams, you signed on to this operation with full knowledge of the stakes. We all did. There's no backing out now, and there's no negotiating with someone who's seen too much. She dies tonight, or we all face court-martial and life in military prison." Those are the only options. The finality in his voice confirmed what Sarah had suspected. This conspiracy went far beyond personal animosity. Sarah made her decision. Using her knowledge of the terrain and her newly acquired night vision equipment, she began moving toward a position that would allow her to engage Collins directly. But instead of planning an assault, she was preparing for something more subtle. Her medical bag still contained supplies that could be used for purposes far removed from healing, and she'd been developing a plan that would neutralize the remaining threats without requiring a direct confrontation. The smoke grenades she'd used to escape earlier were just the beginning. Sarah's medical supplies included several containers of pure oxygen, normally used for treating patients with respiratory distress. When mixed with certain other medical chemicals under the right conditions, oxygen could create a blinding flash that would disable night vision equipment and disorient anyone looking in the wrong direction. Combined with the right timing and positioning, it might be enough to turn the tables completely. Sarah worked her way around the perimeter of the rally point, staying hidden while she prepared her improvised weapons. Collins and Williams were positioned back-to-back, covering all approaches with their rifles ready. But they were watching for a direct assault, not for the kind of creative, tactical thinking her medical training had taught her to employ. When everything was ready, Sarah keyed the radio one final time. "Collins, Williams, I'm going to give you both one last chance to walk away from this. Power down your weapons, move to the extraction point, and tell command that Alpha Squad encountered heavy resistance and took casualties. I'll disappear into these mountains and never bother anyone again. You can live with whatever drove you to this point, and I'll live with the knowledge that the people I trusted wanted me dead." Collins's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think this is about choice, Doc? You think we wanted to be here hunting down someone we served with? This is about survival, ours and yours. The only difference is that we're better armed and better trained than you are. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick. Keep fighting, and you'll die slowly in these mountains where no one will ever find your body." Sarah's response was to trigger her improvised flash device, sending a brilliant flare of light blazing across the rally point. The oxygen-fed flash was bright enough to overload night vision equipment and temporarily blind anyone looking in its direction. Collins and Williams both cried out in surprise and pain, their enhanced vision gear rendering them effectively helpless as their equipment struggled to adjust to the sudden change in light levels. Moving quickly while her enemies were disoriented, Sarah activated a smoke grenade and threw it into the center of the rally point. Dense white smoke began billowing across the area, reducing visibility to nearly zero even for someone without damaged night vision. In the confusion that followed, Sarah could hear Collins shouting orders and Williams responding with growing panic, but neither man could see well enough to pose an immediate threat. The final phase of Sarah's plan required her to get close enough to use the remaining medical supplies in her bag. She prepared several syringes filled with a cocktail of sedatives that would render her targets unconscious without causing permanent harm. It was a risk. Getting within injection range meant exposing herself to return fire, but it was also the only way to end the standoff without killing people she'd once considered friends and comrades. Sarah found Williams first, stumbling through the smoke with his rifle held ready, but his movements clumsy and uncertain. His night vision equipment was still malfunctioning from the flash, and he was operating essentially blind in the chemical fog. A quick injection to his neck dropped him within seconds, his body collapsing harmlessly to the rocky ground. Collins proved more challenging. Even blinded and disoriented, the veteran sergeant retained enough tactical awareness to position himself defensively and maintain disciplined fire control. Sarah had to circle around him twice before finding an opening, using the smoke and the terrain to mask her approach. When she finally got close enough to strike, Collins sensed her presence at the last moment and spun to face her with his rifle raised. The confrontation lasted only seconds. Sarah dove low to avoid Collins's hasty shot, rolling across the rocky ground and coming up inside his defensive perimeter. Her syringe found its target in his thigh, delivering its chemical payload before he could bring his weapon to bear for a second shot. Collins fought the sedative effects longer than Williams had, his experience and conditioning allowing him to remain conscious for almost a full minute after injection. But eventually, even his iron will couldn't overcome the pharmaceutical cocktail now coursing through his bloodstream. As the smoke began to clear and Sarah surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation, she found herself alone on the mountain with 4 unconscious soldiers and a growing understanding of how complex her situation had become. She'd successfully defended herself against immediate threats, but she still didn't know the full scope of the conspiracy that had led to this moment. More importantly, she needed to find a way off the mountain and back to safety without falling into whatever trap had been prepared for her return. Sarah gathered the weapons and communications equipment her former squad mates had been carrying, creating a small arsenal that would serve her well if other threats materialized. She also searched through their personal effects, looking for clues about the larger picture she'd only glimpsed in Jackson's photograph. What she found in Collins's pack made her blood run cold and confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the betrayal she'd uncovered. The documents Collins had been carrying revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond Alpha Squad. Names, dates, financial records, and communication logs painted a picture of systematic corruption that involved multiple military personnel, civilian contractors, and potentially foreign agents. Sarah's medical work had apparently brought her too close to discovering evidence of the scheme, making her elimination an operational necessity rather than a personal vendetta. Armed with evidence that could expose the conspiracy and proof of the attempt on her life, Sarah began planning her descent from the mountain. She had the weapons and equipment needed to defend herself, the documentation required to expose her would-be killers, and the tactical knowledge to avoid the remaining threats that undoubtedly waited between her current position and safety. The rookie medic who'd been brought to these mountains to die was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than her enemies had anticipated. As dawn broke over the Afghan peaks, Sarah Martinez began her journey home, carrying with her the means to turn the battlefield against those who had trapped her. The hunt was far from over, but now she was the one doing the hunting.